been in the InfoSec and IT space for a few years, you've likely heard about the zero trust concept of network architecture and security. Vendors love to say that their new solution enables zero trust networks. Whether it's a new identity access solution, endpoint detection and response software, or virtualization technologies, they all claim to enable zero trust. Well, is this true? What is zero trust, and how can we work to achieve it for our organizations? Join me for a review of Zero Trust Networks, Building Secure Systems in Untrusted Networks, by Evan Gilman and Doug Barth, to learn more about zero trust and to see how well these authors answered this question and many more. The authors approach the zero trust discussion very methodically, which is good for anyone trying to learn zero trust in the first place. Discussion starts with an introduction to zero trust fundamentals, where the authors begin by defining a zero trust network based off of 5 fundamental assertions. The authors state that for zero trust, the network is always assumed to be hostile, external and internal threats exist on the network at all times, network locality is not sufficient for deciding trust in a network, every device, user, and network flow needs to be authenticated and authorized, and policies have to be dynamic and calculated from as many sources of data as possible. The authors then continue to highlight the benefits of the implementation of these principles, while also discussing the shortcomings of those traditional castle defense networks that many of us are more familiar with, i.e., those networks with strong perimeter controls and detections, and weak, if any, internal segmentation and awareness. While the authors' points are definitely valid and not wrong per se, the way that zero trust is introduced, it isn't really. It's just a set of principles, some of which are redundant, particularly principles 1 and 2. And the way that it's positioned versus our outdated and traditional approach is an area where I feel the book does fall flat. There's nothing wrong with the underlying principles, and if implemented, they will definitely lead to more secure networks. But as chapter 1 of a zero trust fundamentals book, it's surprising that the underlying concept of what is zero trust is not discussed in more detail. I don't disagree with the authors on the importance of the principles addressed in the chapter and expounded upon during the rest of the book, but I think a better explanation of what zero trust fundamentally is needed to then enable the authors to present their views and potential improvements to the traditional definition of zero trust. So, stepping back from the book for a second, what is zero trust? Zero trust is a strategic initiative that helps prevent successful data breaches by eliminating the concept of trust from an organization's network architecture. Rooted in the principle of never trust, always verify, zero trust is designed to protect modern digital environments by leveraging network segmentation, preventing lateral movement, providing layer 7 threat prevention, and simplifying granular user access control. Now, keying in here, I want to highlight the fact that zero trust is a strategic initiative. It's not a single thing we can do. And its goal is to prevent successful data breaches. As originally envisioned, the purpose of zero trust is not to harden every system and prevent an attacker from gaining any access in a network. That's not the point of zero trust as it was originally envisioned. The point is to prevent data breaches. Zero trust was created by John Kindervag during his tenure as a vice president and principal analyst for Forrester Research. And this was based off of his realization that traditional security models operate on the outdated assumption that everything inside an organization's network should be trusted. Under this broken trust model, it's assumed that a user's identity is not compromised and that all users are going to act responsibly and can be trusted. We already know from years of empirical data that insider threats exist and that attackers can fairly easily gain initial access into a network. The zero trust model recognizes that this trust is a vulnerability. And once inside the network, users are free to move laterally and access or exfiltrate whatever data they are, able to access. Remembering that the point of infiltration of an attack is not often the actual target for why an attack occurred. In zero trust, you identify, or at least in the traditional original view of what zero trust was and how it was meant to prevent data breaches, you identify a protect surface. The protect surface is made up of the network's most critical and valuable data, assets, applications and services, or DAS for short. The protect surface is going to be unique for each organization. Because it only contains what is most critical to an organization's operations, the protect surface is orders of magnitudes smaller than the attack surface, and it is something that is always knowable. Once the protect surface is identified, we are supposed to, in traditional implementations of Zero Trust, identify how traffic moves across the organization in relation to the protect surface. We need to understand who the users are, what applications they use, how they connect, and once we know these things, that's the only way that we can determine and enforce policy that ensures secure access to the data. And once we understand the interdependence between the DAS, infrastructure, services, and users, we can put controls in place as close to the protect surface as possible, creating a microperimeter around it. The microperimeter moves with the protect surface. You can create a microperimeter by deploying segmentation gateways, which in vendor parlance are commonly known as next-generation firewalls, to ensure that only known allowed traffic or legitimate applications have access to the protect surface. Segmentation gateways provide granular visibility into traffic and enforce additional layers of inspection and access control with granular Layer 7 policy based on what's known as the Kipling method, which defines Zero Trust policy based on who is trying to access what, when they're trying to access it, where they're accessing it, why they're accessing it, and how they're accessing it. A mobile client versus a desktop client. So all of those factors from the Kipling method go into us making rich and verbose policies. So the Zero Trust policy determines who can transit the microperimeter at any point in time, preventing access to the protect surface by unauthorized users, and ideally by preventing the exfiltration of sensitive data. Again, whole point is to prevent data breaches. And because of all of these rich pieces of information, Zero Trust is only possible to truly implement at Layer 7. So that is fundamentally the traditional view of Zero Trust. With the introduction of Zero Trust out of the way, we can now discuss some of the remainder of the book. So chapter 2 is called Managing Trust, and it begins with the acknowledgement of a few topics that I wasn't sure that the authors of the book were going to address, but I'm glad to see that they did, and definitely some kudos in my book for that. The first thing they talk about or introduce to the reader is the concept of threat models and trust relationships, and trying to explain that we need to understand what actually is our threat model to understand where a good investment in security would be for our organizations, as well as being able to map out the relationships that exist between users and applications and data to understand where those areas of trust are that could be abused. Because again, in true original understanding of Zero Trust, trust is a weakness. So we need to be able to understand where we have trust in our systems today. The authors then also go on to acknowledge that no solution is perfect. And this is something that I'm really glad to see in the book, because as a book on Zero Trust, it's one of those buzzwords. It's part of like buzzword bingo at the moment. You have things like Zero Trust, and you have threat intelligence and red teaming, and all these are good things when applied properly. But too many organizations like to imagine that there's this one kind of silver bullet solution, and that all their problems will get solved if they just have threat intelligence, or if they just implement Zero Trust. So the author's acknowledgement that no solution is perfect is good to see, especially this early in the book. The book overall, one of the best things I think that it has going for it, is that in order to discuss many of these topics, in order to discuss how to potentially build trust with devices around using things like X509 certificates, the authors actually go into detail and explain the concept of public versus private key cryptography and asymmetric or symmetric encryption, and they break down a lot of these concepts into more foundational levels. And they do this starting in chapter 2 when they introduce the principle of least privilege. And I'm glad to see this because, again, the concept of Zero Trust simply is an application of a lot of things that high security practitioners have known for a while. But it's really just this knowledge kind of being more codified as an overarching concept of let's have less trust. Let's not put trust into the networks. So seeing them introduce the principle of least privilege and explain that you want to always have the least amount of privileges as possible to accomplish any task, because too frequently in engagements and red teams, you'll find that somebody in accounting magically can write to a group policy, and that kind of permissions creep or mispermissions frequently can be leveraged by attackers. So acknowledging that the principle of least privilege is something we want to make foundational to our users and groups in building a zero trust network is something I'm very glad to see the authors do. They also then introduce the concept of the control plane and the data plane. So in zero trust, right, we need to authenticate and authorize all attempts at access, because we don't trust anything. We need to always be validating that the user who's trying to access this file is still the right user based off of their things like where they're accessing it from, how frequently they're accessing it, have they ever accessed it before. In order to do that, at a fundamental level, there's the data plane, which is where our information resides. Think of this as the traditional network. This is the DAS in the more traditional zero trust model. And you have the control plane, which has to be the enforcing policy plane of what is actually permitting or blocking each access attempt that we're talking about being able to control in zero trust. Chapter 3, the authors start talking about network agents. And this is where they start to deviate a little bit from what I'd say is the traditional zero trust model, in that they build out the concept of a network agent. And a network agent is what they view as the primary component of authorization on a zero trust network. And they explain how you can expose and utilize this agent. Now, an agent isn't a piece of software. It isn't a single user. What an agent is a combination of all the data known about the actors in the network request. So this is things like what's the user, what's the application accessing it, and what's the device. And the authors, purport that by combining these additional pieces of information, not just who is accessing it, but from where, what device and how, with what application or what device, we can have a better understanding of the request by looking at the agent, which is all of those pieces of information. So they're starting to get at that Kipling of the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, and the why to authenticate the request, but it doesn't have all of those components. But again, it has some of them, which is still good. So in order to do this, in order to make these authorization decisions, the authors then go on to discuss how do we implement this? What could this look like? And they break it down into 4 logical components in chapter 4, where they talk about the 4 components are enforcement, a policy engine, a trust engine, and data stores. Now, this is where, depending on what an organization is looking for, I feel the book starts to potentially, I won't say fall apart, but it starts to potentially be less applicable. And it's not the author's fault so much as it is zero trust is still very immature, and that's the reason a lot of vendors are getting away with saying that they make zero trust happen. Because, and the authors do a good job calling this out, what is discussed in the book are a lot of, here's how you could do it, with then the caveat of, there's no current open standard or single product that does all these things in the author's mind. So we talk about enforcement. It's, you need to enforce the decision of whether or not access is allowed. And what that looks like could be anything. And the authors explain how they're going to be able to do that. They talk about, installing software on, hosts to, add and remove firewall rules dynamically to say, we see a request coming in to access a file. Should the user have access to the file? Yes, allow the file share connection in. No, prevent the file share connection in, with using things like firewall rules. And they'll address these things, but there is no single standard. And really, when they talk about enforcement being the yes, no, how do we actually prevent access or allow access? The policy engine being the rules that dictate whether or not an agent is allowed to access data. This has to look at a defined policies to understand whether or not the authorization would be valid. And it factors in not just the agent, but also the policies, but also an agent trust score. And now this is, again, a kind of a magical value that is derived by a trust engine, which doesn't exist. We'd have to build our own. And the trust engine is some component that looks at a number of data stores to continually update an agent's trust score. And the purpose here is maybe an agent, again, the combination of a user, a device, and an application, let's say, is accessing a file. And okay, maybe they're a finance user and they access a single finance file. That's not that weird. So it's allowed, and policies say yes. But at some point, maybe that agent has accessed 100,000 files in a short period of time. As it continues to access more and more files at a rate that may be too fast for a human to actually do anything meaningful with, the trust score, or the trust engine, would say, hey, this is really suspicious. We need to prevent this access. So based off of the continuing behavior of the agent in the environment, even though our policies may say, yeah, that's something they should have access to, the trust engine should, in a perfect zero trust world, according to the authors, allow us to identify this anomalous behavior. And even though the policy may say this would normally be allowed, their trust score could drop sufficiently low, and now they aren't allowed access to whatever the resource is that we're talking about. And then the last component of those 4 components is data stores, which are simply just back-end data sources that the policy engine and the trust engine can reference to perform their duties. Okay, so zero trust would have those 4 components: enforcements, a policy engine, a trust engine, and data stores. But none of them really formally exist. There may be different existing data stores we can pull from, and the authors do a good job of identifying those. Things like configuration management, catalogs, things like our asset inventories, to allow us to know, some of those data stores that we could potentially tie into. But the authors then go into chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 of how do we establish trust with our devices, users, applications, and traffic. And this could be nitpicking, but zero trust is about not having trust. So attempting to bake trust into any of those components seems contradictory in a lot of the ways that we're talking about. We need to authenticate every authorization flow. We can't necessarily trust anything. It's the totality of all the information available that's ideally going to allow us to make a good decision. So they do have a need to do this based off of their model and implementation of zero trust, because they define the network agents as combining relevant information about the user, the application, and the device. So it makes sense that in order to do that, they're gonna have to actually ensure that they can trust, in their model, the device that's claiming, if a device is claiming to be a corporate laptop, how do we know it's a corporate laptop? And this is a component that we might want to know. And they go in and discuss how we can do this with things like X509 certificates, TPM platforms, and other types of cryptography, using golden images that could potentially allow us to have a known state of a device and some cryptographic proof that the device is what the device says it is, to allow that component to be factored into the overarching decision process. So overall, the book is a fairly good introduction to components that could make up a zero trust network. My biggest, and following, reading the book and implementing it, you will probably end up with what you could call a zero trust network, where again, you have authorizations and flows validated regularly with enforcement to block, if a user shouldn't be accessing that file from a certain location, or anomalous behaviors from your trust engine being identified. All that stuff would result in functionally a type of zero trust network. My biggest problem with the book is they skip over the entire concept of your DAS, of your protect, what's your protect surface, what's your actual critical crown jewels, because you don't need to necessarily apply zero trust to absolutely everything in an environment. And in doing so, if you follow the author's model, it is going to be very expensive to get there, to implement zero trust as they show it. And again, as a security practitioner, let's take zero trust out of it for a minute. As a security practitioner, we need to know where our crown jewels are. We need to know what information is important and critical in our environments in order to have a solid understanding of, how risk factors in. And what I mean by that is it doesn't matter if it's a red team, it doesn't matter if it's a penetration test, it doesn't matter if it's a vulnerability assessment, it doesn't matter if you're doing security architecture. We need to know where our important data is versus where our non-critical data is, because if we don't have that distinction in our environments, then everything's the same. And, to paraphrase, from The Incredibles, when everyone's super, no one is. And we can't possibly realistically enforce incredibly stringent security controls in absolutely every location, all the time, everywhere, and still be enabling the business to perform its job. We just can't. Like, users, if we apply that level of security to everything, at least with the current technologies available today, users would get frustrated and be unable to do their work. So yes, following the book would give you a zero trust network, but I think it would be better to use the concepts, even if you want to use the concepts as defined in this book, of those 4 components for your zero trust platform in your data and control planes. Instead of making your data plane everything and starting from the endpoints and working in, which is what the authors of this book have us do. They have us learn how to trust our devices first to allow them to authorize to data. We have large enterprises, 100,000 plus endpoints or more. Trying to build trust into 100,000 endpoints is an incredibly large task. If we instead go with the more traditional approach, even if we use some of the components as discussed in this book, if we go with the more traditional approach and identify where our critical assets are to define our microperimeter around our DAS, around our protect surface, instead of having 100,000 endpoints that we need to now build knowledge of and be able to authorize all flows from those endpoints to all data, we simply say, where is our critical data? Who accesses the critical data? And we immediately cut that program that problem from 100,000 plus endpoints to maybe 100, maybe more, maybe less, but a significantly smaller chunk of environment where we can build our microperimeter instead of trying to build this kind of mesh throughout everything that is zero trust everywhere. We start with our critical assets because, again, the point of zero trust is not to prevent a compromise, is to prevent a breach. So in order to prevent the breach, we need to identify where is the data we don't want stolen, where is our sensitive information that would be breached, to then build the microperimeter. And that's where I feel the biggest shortcoming of this book is. Again, it has a solid foundational understanding of many different security and development concepts that I think are beneficial for a lot of people to read. But I just feel like the authors kind of missed the mark in how they're talking about applying it. As an example here, they give some case studies at the end of the book, which are great. But if you look at what Google's done with zero trust, the only public offering that they've come out with is the web proxy, the web application proxy that allows you to basically protect your corporate applications, corporate web-based applications, with a zero trust enabled proxy that allows you to expose sensitive internal corporate applications through this Google proxy and authenticate users, using, again, kind of that agent of who is accessing what, where, why, and how through the Google proxy to get to your sensitive internal applications, which would normally have been protected by something like a VPN. Again, Google's only offering a solution that protects a single type of application, a web application, and you're not going to proxy every single internal corporate application through this type of a thing. You're going to identify the ones that users have a legit access need for, that currently ride over VPN. So again, Google in their offering is very tightly scoping what's actually getting protected with zero trust, which again, I think speaks to the better way to approach this for many organizations. Because when you build that microperimeter, if you're going on the zero trust journey, you can start by identifying some of the most critical assets and protecting just a few of them as you build out this zero trust model. Instead of having to apply it everywhere all at once, you can run your old network the way it's been run for the past 10, 20 years, and you can define this microperimeter around your crown jewels. And those two can coexist peacefully and happily without having to do massive restructuring of your network. So overall, Zero Trust Networks, Building Secure Systems, and Untrusted Networks gets a 3-star rating from me. It's a solid book, but it's not a must-read book for everyone. It contains a lot of great information about the underlying authors' views of zero trust networks. And again, I think it's slightly undermined by the issues highlighted by the authors, that there is no zero trust solution and we're just telling you one way to do it. The fact that zero trust is very immature, as well as the fact that while the proposals in the book are good, technically speaking, the way that they describe how to apply them, as I've said, I think is very lacking. But they do go into good detail. They provide the foundational technologies that could help an organization to transition to a more robust zero trust network. So it's definitely beneficial. I definitely think more junior members of our security and network operations teams, our system administrations teams, would be able to benefit from reading this book. And I think anybody who just wants some more perspective on zero trust would be well served by reading this book. If not because it's an amazing book, because it's probably one of the best zero trust network books that are currently on the market. So at about $30, this isn't an immediate recommendation for all. But if this is an area that you want to learn more about, it's definitely one more perspective to add and one other way to get introduced to a lot of the components of a mature and robust zero trust network.